This is apropos. U.S. forces have begun carrying out fresh strikes on Iran. The U.S. military says the goal is to curb any threats to the Strait of Hormuz. Well, it comes after President Donald Trump warned earlier that he would probably order strikes on the country after declaring a ceasefire between the two sides over. He also lambasted Iran's leaders as scum. Well, the war of words comes after the U.S. fired on 80 Iranian targets in response to strikes on 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran, meanwhile, responded this Wednesday by firing on its Gulf neighbours, Bahrain and Kuwait. Well, despite the renewed fighting, Trump does seem to be leaving the door open for negotiations, as Karis Garland tells us.
The ceasefire between Iran and the United States has repeatedly been described as shaky, but on Wednesday, comments from President Donald Trump added fresh uncertainty.
As far as I'm concerned, it's over. I'll speak to our negotiators. They want to negotiate. They're good people. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. But they have to come back to me. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a waste of time dealing with them. They're liars.
Trump's comments came amid the second flare-up in fighting between Iran and the U.S. since the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding on the 17th of June. The U.S. says Tehran broke that agreement by firing at 3 commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. In response, U.S. Central Command claims to have hit over 80 targets across Iran, focusing on air defense systems, radars, and the small boats used by Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Iran's state media reported explosions in the southern city of Bandar Abbas, where this video was taken, as well as Keshem Island and Sirik. In another measure, the U.S. also revoked a license that temporarily allowed the sale of Iranian oil. Tehran branded the move, along with continued Israeli attacks on Lebanon, as a violation of the ceasefire. On social media, Iran's parliament speaker wrote, "The era of bullying and extortion is over. It leads nowhere. We don't fold." On Wednesday, the Revolutionary Guards said they fired at dozens of U.S. military facilities in Kuwait and Bahrain. Both Gulf countries sounded air raid sirens to warn their citizens of incoming attacks.
Let's bring in Niga Anga now, who is a visiting fellow with King's College London. Niga, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Really good to have you. So we have word now that the US strikes on Iran have begun. How worried are you that we're on the brink of a full return to the war? And if that happens, what's the risk of the conflict drawing in other countries? We know that Gulf states are desperate to avoid becoming both launch pads and targets. How are they likely to respond here?
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. Yes, unfortunately, a lot of this feels like deja vu. We've gone through these sorts of conversations over the last several months. But I think Washington's calculation, they appear to be a bit more narrow than a lot of the rhetoric that we've been hearing from the president today. The strikes have been very large. I don't deny that, but they've been incredibly targeted, which really suggests that there's more of a focused effort to essentially degrade Iran's ability to threaten a lot of the commercial shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz, which is very important, but it also positions, the U.S. in the strait and trying to avoid essentially what you're suggesting, potentially leading into some maximal war situation. At the same time, the United States did revoke the oil license that was reintroduced to allow to relieve a lot of the economic pressure on Iran. So they've done that without entirely closing this diplomatic door. There is an ability to turn that back on. So I see this very much a very sort of practical U.S. national security approach right now. Rebuild leverage again, then see whether diplomacy becomes more realistic, because as you suggested earlier on, the door of diplomacy isn't entirely closed based on what President Trump said today. I think one thing we need to bear in mind, the problem with the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, was that it wasn't so much that diplomacy went wrong. It was the fact that, the framework itself was too vague. There was a lot of discrepancies in there that was unclear, how each party was going to understand the language. And a lot of the important conversations were backloaded to essentially a later stage. And this is where we're finding ourselves right now. There's a lot of ambiguities between both sides, which has essentially turned into this liability where both sides can point fingers at each other. I think Washington right now is trying very much to obviously punish those violations by Iran, but they're also trying to protect these shipping lanes and trying to keep, in some ways, negotiations alive without looking like they want to go into full war. So I think those goals are getting very hard to reconcile at this point. We're going to have to see how this plays out. But I would say, I think right now, everything feels a bit more calculated. I just hope that it stays calculated and not leading into another war like we saw earlier this year.
Well, from what you're saying, it seems that the deal isn't dead. Trump has praised what he called tremendous love and tremendous unity among NATO leaders today at the summit. He previously has voiced a lot of frustration that allies weren't joining the military effort. Do you think he could use this moment to sort of make support for US strikes a test of loyalty among NATO partners right now?
I think that's a very interesting question. We know that he spent quite a bit of time during those closed-door conversations discussing Iran, discussing the importance of it. I think there is an element that the economic repercussions of the Strait of Hormuz is more global and not necessarily solely impacting the United States. So I think there's an element of those conversations that could have taken place, but we're going to have to see. I think we'll have to see over the next few days whether other countries are going to feel empowered and whether they have skin in the game to join these efforts.
Well, let's circle back to the Memorandum of Understanding, which you mentioned earlier. The original 60-day diplomatic window barely lasted 3 weeks. What do you think the two sides are going to have to agree on to ensure that we get this deal over the finish line and it's not put on a hold with tit-for-tat attacks?
Right, exactly. I think, the next step is going to be very useful and important. And I think what will happen is not necessarily a grand ceremony or even some sort of vague political declaration again. I think you're going to have these much more quieter back channel diplomacy talks, trying to understand how they can stabilize the situation through diplomacy, but then also how they get sequenced. I think first and foremost, there's going to have to be sort of an immediate maritime deconfliction and an importance of understanding that each side is going to have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz essentially entails. But there's going to have to be some form of freeze kind of arrangement, if Iran halts further attacks on the shipping and regional bases, or the U.S.'s regional bases, then the U.S. can then define a little bit more what that sanctions relief could look like, and then obviously will eventually, hopefully, turn into those discussions around the nuclear file. But I think right now, being able to not only sequence those conversations, because the Strait of Hormuz is front and center of the entire conversation, and being able to do those without being in the public eye. I think both sides, both the United States and Iran, have a domestic political problem that they're trying to contend with. Obviously, President Trump, does not want to show that we're leading into potentially another long war in the Middle East. Obviously, the midterm elections are around the corner, and on Iran's side, again, they need to be able to show that they have leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. They have been impacted. The inflation in Iran is extremely high, so they need to be able to show their public that they continue to look as though they're victorious in this effort.
Well,
And so I think each side.
Please go on.
Sorry. I was going to say, I think each side has a lot to lose and a lot to gain. And so over the next couple of days, I think we're going to see probably a bit more conversations behind the scenes.
Well, you're absolutely right that there is a domestic political angle with all of this. The midterms approaching, Trump's struggling with approval ratings at the moment. He has argued that ending the war would quickly bring down energy prices, which a lot of Americans are complaining about right now. But of course, all this fighting that's been renewed now escalates all of that again. It undermines his argument, doesn't it?
It does. And I think, again, I think this is why there's going to be a concerted effort to be able to have those conversations. The market, again, was very cautious over the last 24 hours. We've seen prices of oil go up. It rose up quite dramatically. It's the summer season. There's flights. The American public wants to be able to go on holiday. They do drive around the country. Therefore, gas prices again went up again today. So there is a huge concern. And so I think, again, you're going to have a concerted effort to try to bring down the tension for the market, try to get ships going through the Strait of Hormuz before the summer season is over.
Oniga, this is a fast-moving situation, but just give us your prediction of what you think will happen in the next few days and the next few weeks in order to get all sides back to the negotiating table now.
Yeah, I think, again, we'll see a bit of, tit for tat. We'll see some targeted attacks by both sides, but there is going to be an element where mediators are going to be sitting down with both sides and trying to bring them together to, again, have these back channel conversations. I think Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz is very clearly front and center of these conversations. There's going to have to be an articulation of what was understood in that memorandum of understanding, and being able to, again, bring about some sort of ceasefire so these conversations can continue. Again, both sides really do need the market to calm down. And so I think that is an element that the mediators can focus on when bringing both sides together. Again, both sides need to find an off-ramp, a diplomatic off-ramp, and that essentially is going to be the key piece to calm those markets down. So I think that will be the first and foremost priority. And then we're going to have to see if there's going to be a sequenced effort from there to talk about the other components of the negotiations, as was agreed in the MOU, to have those 60 days of technical talks. But until they're able to calm tensions down, those technical details, the stickier details that get us past this first stage will take some time.
Niga Anga, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Really great to get your thoughts today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.